speakers.
Recording in progress.
Tonight's speakers are Tim and Jenny Griffiths. They have recently returned from the Antarctic Peninsula. Tim is the author of the historical novel Endurance, which tells the story of the Shackleton expedition through the eyes of the photographer Frank Hurley. Tim has done 4 trips to the Antarctica as a history lecturer / guide with Aurora Expeditions, and Jenny has visited the Antarctic as a guest with Aurora Expeditions. Tim is currently planning his own expedition to carry out a heritage survey of the site of Shackleton's encampment on Elephant Island. So with that brief introduction, I'll hand over to Tim and Jenny to tell us a bit more about themselves and all about their adventures in the Antarctic.
Thank you, Tim. Now, Jenny, you are welcome at any stage. At any stage at all, to come up here if I say something incorrect. Thanks, Kim. First of all, let me say congratulations on that 70th year. That is pretty fantastic. And, you know, for as long as I can remember, there's always been an Oatley Flora and Fauna Association. So it's fantastic to see you still thriving on a wet night tonight. It's pretty good. But I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous custodians of the land. I guess they were the original Oatley Flora and Fauna Association. And I'd like to thank the association and the committee for inviting me here tonight, and for Adrian as well. I'd like to acknowledge Adrian, who sadly can't be here. He's got a terrible headache, I'm told, and couldn't make it. But thank you for inviting me, especially since I'm actually from the Shire. Yeah, I grew up in Caringbah. Someone said to me, the best place to live in Sydney, that'd be the lower North Shore. So with that in mind, I moved to St. Susie. But as communicated, for the last couple of years, I've had this great privilege and to be able to visit Antarctica as a guest of Aurora Expeditions. You know, it just was a very special privilege, and to do so in the capacity as a history lecturer and guide has been just a most wonderful experience. So I will show you some photographs from the trips I've done there. Adrian asked me, he said, look, people would like to see photos of your time, Jenny's, and your time in Antarctica. So I'll show some photographs. But I wanted to also talk a bit about history, and the reason I think I was able to get the gig as a guest of Aurora Expeditions was because I had the good fortune, against all the odds, to have Allen and Unwin publish my book about Frank Hurley, the photographer, and his time with Shackleton in the Antarctic. And it's amazing what one thing will lead to, and that certainly, I think, gave rise to my opportunity to spend time in Antarctica. So I will talk a little bit about Shackleton and the Endurance voyage, as well as showing you some images about my own trip and Jenny's trip. And I will mention at the end that I do have an ambitious plan, maybe a pipe dream, but I'm hoping it comes off, to conduct an expedition to Elephant Island in Antarctica to see whatever happened to the final encampment of Shackleton's crew from Elephant Island, where they were eventually rescued by Shackleton. So with that, I'll start taking you through now. Graham, do you want me to have an indicator, or should I click through?
Yeah, just got to use the button to flick through. That's a
Can I use it?
laser pointer.
I think that this one.
Yeah, the buttons are reversed on this, so you have to press the right hand one.
No. Okay, I can just do this. Yeah. So that is the man, Frank Hurley, who had such an adventurous life that he was a bit of an inspiration to me, and led to my taking a very strong interest in his travels. And we'll hear some more about his. We'll see some of his photographs tonight, which are a lot better than my photographs. Anyhow, if you do manage to do a trip to Antarctica, you'll probably go to the Antarctic Peninsula. These days, there are a number of voyages which will take you straight below Australia and New Zealand down to the Australian part of Antarctica, around Commonwealth Bay. But that's quite relatively rare. Most people will go to the peninsula. So if you can think of South America coming down as a point and sticking down into the Southern Ocean, there's part of Antarctica, which is a peninsula which sort of sticks up and almost meets South America. And that is the Antarctic Peninsula. And that is a stunningly beautiful part of Antarctica to visit. And it's quite accessible, whereas other parts of Antarctica are incredibly remote in the interior, and you have to do a lot of travelling to get there. But the peninsula, you can see a lot just from a boat. It is spectacular, and the other benefit is it's only 2 days travel across the Drake Passage. And that tends to be the big inhibitor for people, that it's 2 days when you may not feel so well if you're unused, if you don't have your sea legs. But these boats that will do these trips are usually smaller, and they'll carry a maximum of about 130 people. If they have more than that, they will run into restrictions on how many can go ashore. And so, you do have the benefit of having a boat with a lot fewer people on board, which makes it a lot more of a pleasant experience. And so when you go there, you're going to see a lot of ice, and you're going to see some spectacular formations and icebergs. You sort of just want to jump in. It's so beautiful. So let's do that. You're going to see some penguins. I think they are Gen 2 penguins. And just beautiful scenery. Everywhere you look is just stunning. If you're lucky, and you might be able to get a photo of the penguins in the water and leaping out of the water. I should say at the outset that I took all of these photos just on my mobile phone. I'm not a photographer, and these are just casually taken images. So there's really no reason why you wouldn't get the same images on your own camera. And if you're a bit of a photographer, you'll get some spectacular images. The trick with these guys is basically you press the shutter when you can't see them. And by the time the photo takes, hopefully the penguin's risen out of the water. Anyone tell me what type of penguin we're looking at there? Chinstrap, yeah, for obvious reasons. And the other thing about these photos is that Aurora staff get a lot of flack because they will often show photos to people and they'll say, oh, look, you must have been very close to that penguin. You're in breach of the requirements down there to stay a certain minimum distance from the wildlife. And that is true. So that often Aurora ends up, and I think all the companies get letters saying, oh, we saw someone's photos and looked like they were right next to some wildlife. Sometimes the wildlife just comes at you, and you won't have time to move. And the penguins are incredibly game. But I also have been using a telephoto, well, not telephoto, a zoom lens on my camera. What about this penguin? It's a Lycanembra. It's a king, yeah. It's a bit smaller. And this guy, rockhopper. Yeah. And you'll get to places where you're looking across, in this case, a plain. It's called Salisbury Plain, and all you can see is penguins. Now, the guys with the brown fur, they're the chicks, and they're invariably bigger than their parents. And in the sky above, it's not surprising to see a skua, which are birds of prey, and they're just constantly hovering, looking for eggs that might be temporarily not being looked after. Just the parents might turn away and they'll grab the eggs and fly off, or a chick that doesn't thrive. That gives you an idea. That's just waiting to be fed. These are the albatross. Now, these photos are taken actually on the Falklands before, which is sort of immediately east really, of the very bottom tip of South America. And they're a black-brown albatross. And once again, you will go to their nesting areas, and it's very hard to sort of keep away from them because they don't seem to have any great fear of humans. And then in the background there, again, you can see a rockhopper. So they seem to get on quite well. They'll often be together, living harmoniously. So there's a king penguin, quite oblivious to the size of elephant seal. And these are massive creatures. They're as big as a small car. And they are the beach masters. So alongside this elephant on the right-hand side there is a fur seal. And fur seals are very big and they're very intimidating if they come at you. And so that gives you an idea of the size of an elephant seal. They're very attractive, aren't they? Now, they're also elephant seals. They're the babies. And they are so cute. And again, we were just sitting in our zodiac on the edge of the shore, and they just came up alongside the zodiac and just constantly just hung in there and played around and, was quite fascinated by us. They've got a lot of growing to do, so they seem to have so much spare skin. They look like the... who was it? Yes. Yeah, they are amazing, but very cute. And that is a Weddell seal, which is quite a bigger type of seal. You're going to see lots of animals. That's a little baby fur seal. So you're going to see some sea life too. And here's just again, we were just on the boat at this stage, and a large sort of hunting pack of no, they're killer whales, orcas, came past, and just extraordinary to see them. And there must have been about 12 in the pod. It's quite huge, and they hang around quite a bit. There's slightly different coloration to the orcas you'll see in other parts of the world. You're going to see a lot of whales, and you'll see a lot of humpbacks. And in this next photo, we're just in our zodiac, minding our own business, and this very large fin whale just came up and breached alongside us. It was quite amazing. Most of these companies will take you on. You have an option of various things to do, and they pretty much all offer kayaking. And you can see it's just stunning scenery to have that opportunity. You're in a dry suit, so if you did have a mishap, you'd be okay for a while. You can go snowshoeing. So just from where we land, there's people that just snowshoe on a zigzag path up the mountain. And again, a really spectacular activity, quite safe. You're going to have a guide with you who's going to go ahead with a probe, because the big issue is if there's any basically any sorry, what do I think of? Crevasses, hidden crevasses, and or like a bridge where there's a risk of going through. And that's always an issue in the Antarctic Peninsula. And then you can just walk in your boots and just see some spectacular scenery. That's another activity you can do. You can camp. And it looks intimidating, but the groups I've gone with, we've camped, and we didn't use a tent. We just had a sleeping mat and a very good sleeping bag and as many layers as you could put on. And usually the nights were fine. If it was adverse weather, the boat wasn't too far away, and in fact, you can see the boat in the very distance at the top there. But certainly, I've always been super comfortable. And the other thing about that is that's probably taken at 10 o'clock at night. So it's not going to doesn't get very dark.
No one admits to being calm.
Yeah. You can do the old one. Yeah, if you want to do that. Also, there's a lot of history down there because, especially South Georgia and parts of the peninsula and the islands nearby, there's massive amounts of whaling and sealing that went on, and so a lot of ruins and wrecks and graveyards and old buildings that are colossal to look at. This is Fort McCroy, which is a very old base established by the Brits a long time ago, and it's been permanently occupied by them since the 1940s. I recall they established a base there because the Argentinians had gone in, and the Brits were unhappy about that, went in and put up their own base and have kept it permanently manned since. So there is a lot of tension still exists between. There is an Antarctic Treaty, and under that treaty, the purpose of the treaty essentially is to protect Antarctica from being spoiled, and certainly to stop any military activity taking place, and also to stop any mining taking place. And it's been a wonderful treaty since it was entered into, but whether or not we can maintain it, it comes up for review every so often, and certainly there's some countries which are quite interested in looking at what mineral resources exist in Antarctica. And there are ongoing tensions between the countries as to their presence in Antarctica. And one of the reasons, I think, is countries like Britain and Australia maintain our presence there is that I think in the back of their minds, they're thinking that one day there may be an open slather. And I think they tend to try and keep a foot in the door in case that happens. There's countries which, certainly a lot of countries which are nowhere near Antarctica have bases there. This is it's a very pretty little village almost. It's a town of Grytviken, which the Norwegians established for whaling 100 years ago, or more. And it's quite pretty in that photograph. But when the Norwegians were there, the whole of that foreshore would be lined with whale carcasses and whale skeletons. And the water would be covered in a thick slick of oil. And if you had to get out in a rowing boat and try and row in that beautiful water, as you pulled the oars out of the water, they'd be covered in intestines. And you'd soon get stuck just trying to row. So filthy was it that the Norwegians saw no reason to do anything other than just leave the carcasses where they were. They were not taking whales for their food or for anything except the oil. And it was a terrible mess, from the late 19th century, early 20th century. They got to a point where they gave up their business there. I think they sold their rights to the Japanese, and the Japanese tried whaling there for a while, but it became uneconomic and have stopped. That's a beautiful little church in Grytviken, and in front some old boilers where they would basically boil down the whale blubber. And it's Grytviken which is on the island of South Georgia. So it's well north of Antarctica itself, but it's in the Antarctic waters. And that is where Shackleton set out from when he did his attempt, what he called the Trans-Antarctic Expedition in 1914. And the background of that, you may recall, is that by 1911, Amundsen and Scott had their tussle over who would get to the South Pole first. Even before that, Scott and Shackleton had been vying to get to the South Pole. And I think in 1909, I have to check the date, maybe earlier, Shackleton got to within 90 miles, I think, of the South Pole, but had to turn back. And there was a great rivalry between these two men. And in the end, of course, the opportunity came for Scott to go there in 1911. He thought he was going to have it all to himself. Amundsen at that stage had announced he was going to go to the North Pole. And that's what he told everybody, including his crew. As soon as they left Norway, in fact, he turned the boat south and advised his crew they were going to go to the South Pole and try and get there before Scott. Shackleton missed out that opportunity, and so he devised his own plan, which is what he said was a great plan for the Empire, which was to be the first country to carry its flag across from one side of Antarctica to the other, and that this was a great and important achievement that needed to be done by the British in particular. And that's what he called his Trans-Antarctic Expedition. And he was keen on that expedition to have a good photographer, because his expedition was funded by a large newspaper in London, and they said, we need really good photographs for our newspaper. Photography was coming into its own, the quality was improving all the time. And at that stage, the photographer who'd gone with Mawson, and Mawson had been very successful in the area of Antarctica below Australia, around Commonwealth Bay, his photographer was Frank Hurley. And Mawson's images were so successful in London that Shackleton headhunted Hurley and said, I want you to join me for my Trans-Antarctic expedition. And will you meet me in Buenos Aires? Which Hurley promptly did, and met Shackleton and got on board the Endurance. And they set off from South America, and they reached this place, Grytviken. And in Grytviken, it was very busy. As I described, it was polluted and horrible, really, but the Norwegians were going full bore. And the Norwegians said to Shackleton, whatever you do, do not try and go to Antarctica, because we can tell you that you will encounter ice and you will not reach Antarctica. You will become stuck in the ice, and 2 ships before you have suffered that fate. Both became stuck in the ice. One of them sank, and the other ones were very lucky to be rescued after their boat sank as well. People have different minds and different opinions about Shackleton, but I have a view that he was in a situation where he couldn't go back. He couldn't go back to England. All he was going to meet there was his unhappy wife and a lot of creditors. And the only thing for him to do was to plough on to try and reach Antarctica and achieve his Trans-Antarctic goal, which was also going to make him famous. And so, completely contrary to the advice of the Norwegians, who were experts and knew that area very well, Shackleton set off. And within literally weeks, going the wrong way. Endurance was stuck in the ice. And Endurance was a a relatively new boat. Actually, this really was its maiden voyage. It had been built for use in the Arctic, and the company that had built it went bust, and Shackleton got a deal, good price, and bought it to take to Antarctica. And it had a steam engine as well. So in this photograph, they've got their sails up, they're stuck in the ice. They've got the steam engine going, they've got the full sails up, they're trying to push their way through the ice. At times, they got all the crew out. They went to the top of the mast. They could sort of see cracks in the ice or a lead in the ice. They sent the crew down to shovel and use their picks and digger, trying to expand the crack in the ice and sail the boat through it. And they did that over a period of months and months. It's very hard work. And in fact, what happened was that they made more progress, not by virtue of the ships sailing, but by virtue of the movement of the ice. So when you get down to the Weddell Sea, which is where they were, the Weddell Sea was completely frozen over, but the ice there just basically moves clockwise around a bay through the whole of the Weddell Sea, comes down on the eastern side and then up on the western side, right alongside the Antarctic Peninsula. And the Endurance was stuck in the ice and had nothing to do except go where the ice took it. And so for the next year, that's where the Endurance was, stuck in the ice, with no real prospect of reaching land and being able to land his Trans-Antarctic Expedition. And then you may know the story of what then happened to the Endurance. They survived a winter. Sun went down, as you know, didn't come up again, and the next morning you have a long Antarctic winter. It's dark the whole time. It's freezing cold. They're not meant to be there. They know in their heart of hearts they're not going to get to do their Antarctic crossing. It's a very depressing situation, and a very unhappy situation for Shackleton and the crew. They had a whole lot of dogs with them, as you know as well. The dogs were to help take their sleds across the Antarctic. They had to look after the dogs, exercise them on the ice throughout the winter. And they survived the winter. And then spring came, and then the sun rose up above the horizon. But with that, the additional warmth of spring started the ice moving, and the ice expanded and started pushing, and then great pressure waves would go through the ice shelf in which firmly sat the Endurance. The problem with the Endurance was that, unlike Amundsen's vessel, the Fram, which you may recall had been specially designed with a very rounded hull, so that when the Fram was stuck in the ice in the north, which was certainly going to happen, as the ice squeezed, the Fram would pop up and sit on top of the ice shelf, and it could stay the whole winter there. And when the ice thawed, it would drop back into the ocean. The trouble with the Endurance was it had been built for basically a tourist operator, a guy who was going to run luxury travel in the Arctic. As I said, the company went bust. And the difference is that the Fram, whereas a very roly-poly boat, the Endurance was built for comfort. It had a very square sides and square hull underneath, so it was basically like right angles. So designed to sort of stay nice and flat, but it was the wrong sort of boat to have in this situation. So when the ice started, these pressure waves came through the ice and it started to squeeze. It was just like a concertina, this enormous amount of pressure on the sides of the boat. And eventually, as you would imagine, the ice pierced the sides of the boat. The boat didn't move, it was still there. It was stuck in the ice, but water poured in. And eventually, Shackleton was doing his best to maintain the morale of the men, but eventually they had to abandon ship and move everybody and everything and all the dogs and all their cargo out of the Endurance and onto the ice shelf, because they knew at any point in time the Endurance was going to go to the bottom. So Hurley enjoyed himself. He got out there with his camera and took some great photos of the Endurance stuck in the ice. He took photographs of the crew, and at this stage they're looking pretty chipper. There's even a few smiles. Um, that is Shackleton. You may know him or of him. I won't, yeah. When you read a lot of the Antarctic history, you recognise some of these other people. There's a fellow there, this guy called Crean, who was one of the ones who was with Shackleton when they managed to do his journeys to South Georgia, looking for help. So these were the guys who were then stuck on the ice, and they were stuck there for a long time, as I said. This is Shackleton on the right, and on his left, that's Hurley, who's skinning a penguin, I think. And what I want to draw your attention to there is, between the two of them is a stove, and this is something, you can see what that's something there, there's a stove. It's probably using wood at this stage, but in the top section, you'll see sticking out is a big block of ice. So they're in the middle of the world's biggest desert, and there's no water. So the only way to drink, to survive, is to melt ice. So pretty much the whole time you're there in Antarctica, you are thawing ice. You're trying to make water, and you've got to feed, and everyone's got to drink to survive. So that would be running almost the whole time. But that stove ended up staying with the crew, and with some very clever work that Hurley was able to do, because he was not just a photographer, but he was a very skilled metal worker. He was able to use that stove in a way, very ingenious way, to keep the men alive when they eventually were stranded on Elephant Island. You can see behind there's another lifeboat, and they basically had little settlement on the ice. And they lived on the ice for many months, drifting, unable to do anything themselves. Initially Shackleton required the men to try and drag the boats from where they were to the edge of the ice. He thought if we could drag the boats across the ice, we'd get to the open sea, then we could launch our lifeboats and paddle somewhere, row somewhere. But the terrain was so difficult. There were so many, the ice is not flat. So as they dragged the boats across the ice, the ship's carpenter, a guy called McNeish, complained and eventually rebelled and refused to keep dragging the boats any further, and led to a near mutiny. Shackleton ordered his second-in-command, a guy called Wild, to get the gun and the ship's articles and read the riot act to McNeish. And a mutiny was averted, but it was very close, a very close-run thing. That's one of Hurley's brief photographs of the Endurance at night, during the long Antarctic night. And to take a photograph like that, what Hurley had to do was he had a whole lot of metal pans in which he put mercury, and he would put them every 20 metres or so around the boat, and he put some actually on top of the boat. And he had them all connected by wire, and so he had them so they all went off at the same time and lit up the boat like this. And then he would open the lens of the camera to get the image. So I mentioned the ice eventually had its way with the Endurance, and it just had these pressure waves going through, pushing the boat over up on its side. At this stage, the lifeboats are still up on the side of the Endurance. Got a crew member here. The next photo is getting more severe. Some brave soul has climbed the rigging, but it's not looking good. The rudder is totally damaged on this stage, so the ship's probably unsaleable in any case. Eventually it starts to see water come in. They have to completely empty all the cargo off the Endurance, all what they need to survive. The dogs looking very sad, and for good reason. This is the second-in-command, Frank Wild, looking pretty mournful. And you can imagine, you come there by ship, you're stuck in the ice, the ship's going to sink, no one knows where you are, and you're stuck on the ice. Now, the next photo, just to have a look at that. So that's the ship. It's covered in ice. But this next photo is what then happened, although we didn't find this out until last year. So the ship sank 3 miles. 3 miles the ship sank from the ice to the bottom of the Weddell Sea. And you know that 2 years ago, a crew was able to find the wreck of the Endurance. And it's obviously just fallen down through the water, training its masts and sails, and I think they probably acted like a tail. So the boat's just lowered itself down and landed on the sea floor. And equipment spread everywhere. That's the stern. But meanwhile, Shackleton and his crew have found the ice around them starts to melt and cracks form in the ice, and then they open up and suddenly they find themselves no longer on a flat, stable ice shelf. They're on a piece of ice about the size of a football field. And then it splits, on the size of a piece of ice the size of a hockey field, and then a tennis court. And then it's just getting more and more severe. So they eventually have to launch the boats. And when they get on the boats, there's strong currents. They have 3 boats at this stage, but the crew are in terrible way. They're all suffering from hypothermia. They've got malnutrition. They've had terrible diet. They've been suffering the cold, and they're very weak. They have to row, avoid all the ice flows for a number of days. And eventually, after 3 or 4 days, they see over the horizon a bit of land sticking up, and it's Elephant Island. And this is the island they saw. And if you're any island in the world you were going to go to in a boat to be rescued or to try and save yourself, it would not be Elephant Island. It is the most precipitous, unforgiving piece of land you would ever want to come across. The mountains rise up a few thousand feet. It's got many glaciers on it. On the right-hand side here, you can see there's a glacier just falling down into the water the whole time. So you cannot afford to go anywhere near that. And if you're on a boat that goes down today, you cannot afford to be anywhere near that ice, because even within a couple of 100 metres of it, because if it falls, or if a piece falls, or a big piece falls, there's going to be waves coming. So it's quite dangerous to go anywhere near it. But the crew, they managed to get to the island, and then they start rowing along the shore, just looking for somewhere where they could come ashore and land, set up a tent and try and dry. But there's nowhere. It's all hospitable. And you can sort of see here, this little piece of land, or it's an island actually sticking up here. This is just completely, by the way, this is an incredibly calm day. I was lucky enough to be here on this day. It's a beautiful day, but even on a day like this is a very dangerous area. There's no way you could come ashore here, and you're so exposed. As I say, you can't go ashore here because of the glacier, and all these areas along here, it's just very steep. Anyhow, they must have spied this little piece of land here. It looks like an island, but actually it's connected to the mainland by a little isthmus behind it. And that's where they rowed in, and eventually they found some shelter there. So that little island is now on the left-hand side here. So you come around to the western side of it, and that's what we're looking at as an island. And then behind it, there's this low line, just a lot of rocks, and a very narrow isthmus to the land here. Now they choose to bring the boat ashore here. They can't, there's no way they can get up here. They can't get into the interior, and they certainly can't go anywhere here because that's where the glacier is. This is just ice crash. It was here on the day that I was there. And this is summer. When they were there, it was winter. This is Hurley's photograph. So to take this photograph, he's somehow clambered up here. Not quite sure where, but he's up in this area here. He's taken a photo looking down, looking north. So I'm afraid this is not a great image, and the original is a lot better. But he's looking north down at, onto this little area which is called Point Wild, and that's where they stayed. But not in that area where the mountain is. They put the two lifeboats they had spared here, upside down. So that little dark patch there is two lifeboats turned upside down. They put a row of rocks here, a row of rocks behind it, turned that lifeboats upside down and rested them on the two rock walls. And that's where they made their encampment. And that's where they lived for a number of months. And of course, you can see it would have been bitterly cold. They were there for the whole winter, and when there was no light at all, when the sun went down, and that was it. You can see there's a figure there, small person. You can see the snow here is quite brown or dirty looking, and that's because that's where the men moving around. There's probably a latrine, probably somewhere here. There's an area where they slaughter seals and penguins to stay alive. You can see in this image, not good. It's the middle of winter and all the penguins and seals have left. So at this stage, they are really desperate and running out of food. Before that happened, they endeavoured to kill as many penguins as they could to build up a larder to get through the winter. You can see here there's a little trail. Obviously, you could walk around a little bit. On this side, around here, there are two caves where the men could, if they really had the shits with their others living under, there were 22 men living under these two boats. It wasn't good. There were two caves they could go into. Yeah, that should give you an idea. But Hurley's photograph, by this stage, by the way, I think someone before mentioned the story of Hurley. He had like a full plate and half plate cameras which take these brilliant images. And he had a whole lot of beautiful slides that he'd taken. And when they started to drag the boats across the ice, Shackleton insisted everyone throw out everything surplus to requirements. And he didn't trust Hurley by this stage, and so he made Hurley sit down. They went through all of Hurley's glass plates, and Shackleton smashed every one except for 130. And they were allowed, Hurley was allowed to bring 130 plates with him. He ran out of film, or glass plates by this stage. So all he had left to take images with on Elephant Island was a little vest pocket brownie camera. Some of your parents probably had little Kodak brownie cameras. So these images are not very good images. So this is another photo I've taken coming on the eastern side and looking across the spit. So their boat was here, and this is slightly more sheltered. This side has the glacier dropping off, and then waves would regularly form and flow across the low-lying spit. And you can see all the penguins. So this photograph is taken in about November. So still a lot of penguins there. And seals getting ready to breed. This is a close-up again. You see the penguins, and see, I have studied the maps and I've studied the images taken by Hurley and others, and the best I can work out is that their boats were here, where they put the two boats tied together side by side, and the rest of them encamped. I should mention, because this is a key part of the story, I haven't mentioned it, of course, that what happened very shortly after they arrived, Shackleton took the James Caird and attempted to sail 1,300 kilometres to get help back on South Georgia. And after he left, of course, people were not holding out great odds that he would make it to South Georgia. And that meant that no one in the world would know where these men were stuck on Elephant Island. Close in again. So that is a photo Hurley took of his boat. The two boats upturned. You can see here there's a wall of rocks here. There's a wall of rocks there. They've hung the two boats side by side over them. They've got sails and canvases, and they've tied them across the top to stop, because in the winter, like you can imagine, in gales, the snow and the rain's just coming in, and the men are trying to sleep under here. They had a mezzanine level, which is interesting. So there are seats, as you can imagine here, seats here in the boat. So some men volunteered to sleep on the upside down part of the seats. They slept up there, and then other men slept on the ground here. One of the problems was that, as I said, there was the glaciers dropping here. They would send waves coming across the spit, which would flow into the bottom here of the encampment. And then when the spring came, the snow melted anyhow, and they constantly, under here was filling up with water. So some other images said that they had to dig drains to drain the water out of their encampment. But this photo is looking south. Now, it's not in this photo, so it hadn't been put up at the stage, but Hurley took that stove I mentioned, and we looked at that photograph of it, and he erected it, put it inside the two huts to keep the men warm, and he had a little chimney coming out here. And they didn't have wood. What they had was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of penguins with blubber. So it was a blubber stove. But a blubber stove is very peculiar. You've got to get the fire going, you've got to warm up the blubber to melt it so it forms a liquid. And then that becomes the fuel which burns and cooks. And then you're cooking the rest of the penguins or seals or whatever it is you've got. And using that, he was able to keep the men alive underneath these boats and feed them. And look at the gear lying around, there's trash, all their stuff. You know, they had a lot of weapons, a lot of equipment from the boat. They did have a rifle and for shooting seals and so on, and an enormous amount of equipment and gear and food and supplies. And they're waiting and waiting to see whether Shackleton's going to return. This is the photo I took, and again, this is just this most magic day. We've come ashore. This is very rare to be able to land on Elephant Island. Is like a one in 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. Many people go there, they never get a chance to land, but we were just there on this day where we had this magic sea. But even though it's flat, there's this enormous surge. So the water's just constantly just breathing almost over the island. So there's a lot of movement. It's not a very safe place, even at the best of times. On the island, there's a statue of Captain Pardo, a Chilean naval captain. He was a lieutenant, actually. I think he became captain because of what he did. So Shackleton eventually made the journey, one of the longest small boat journeys in the world. He managed to reach South Georgia, and of course Shackleton then wanted to get a boat to go back and rescue the rest of the crew. It took him 4 attempts. Each time he went back, he couldn't get to Elephant Island because it was iced in. The sea was iced up, so there was no way he could get there. Only on the 4th attempt, with Captain Yoko, Captain Pardo, did he make it and rescue the men. Now, when he got to Elephant Island after this 4th attempt, he was worried the sea was going to turn to ice again. So as soon as he touched shore, he didn't go ashore. He said to the men, just get on. They were still having lunch at the time. They all just jumped in the boat and went back, and they were completely off the island within less than an hour. So they left everything there, including the hoosh, their meal, cooking on the stove inside the upturned boats. There's Louis Pardo looking north along the island. Now, what interests me is what happened to the boats and the whole encampment and all of their tools, the carpentry tools, their cooking equipment, tins, pots, pans, everything they had. At the moment, you can see it's covered in snow for one thing. But the other problem why no one to my knowledge has ever done a proper survey of this quite historic area is because of these guys. These are chin-strap penguins, and they're there all summer. So there's no way you're ever going to get permission to go and do a proper historical heritage survey while they're there. The actual site of the boats, I think, was just in this location here. This is the men I mentioned, this is the James Caird. I mentioned the men used the James Caird, relaunched it. They built it up a little bit higher on the gunnels and strengthened it. And Shackleton went with Crean and Worsley and a few others and did that majestic journey across the South Georgia to get help. And essentially, if you sort of look at, they're looking at, remember I said there's an island offshore? That's that island offshore. And you can sort of recognise the contours from Hurley's photo, from this photo here. You can sort of see that photo we're looking at was taken over here, looking north, and you can sort of see the contours of that island in this photo up here. And that's a replica of the James Caird, which is in Grytviken. So if you do get to Grytviken, you'll see the replica. There's another. The original James Caird is in England. Now, this is the crew taken on Hurley's vest pocket Kodak camera. Not a great image. These men are filthy. They have no change of clothes. They've been living in the same place for more than a year. They live inside that snow-covered upturned boats. See the chimney sticking out there now. You can't see the boats because they're covered in snow. Inside, I said there's a blubber stove. So the blubber stove makes black smoke the whole time, all day, every day. They're eating oily fish and penguins. So they're filthy. They don't shave, of course. They all have pipes. They don't have tobacco. So they're ingenious at scraping old seaweed and all sorts of things and seeing if they can get it to light. And to somehow relieve the tedium of where they are. And things were not happy, I can tell you, between these men, much as a lot of the books will suggest they were. The reality is far different. They were a mixture of academic scientists, intellectuals who'd been to university, had degrees in biology and zoology and meteorology, and just rough and tough British sailors. So you know, there was classic British class structure, dynamics happening under these two upturned boats. This is Hurley's photograph waiting goodbye to James Caird, hoping they could be rescued. This is a photograph when the Yoko finally did arrive and they are about to be rescued. This is taken from the hut, or the hut where the boats are. And you can see just here, they've dug a drainage ditch to help drain the water from under, foul smelling water too, from under the boat where it's camped. But all this stuff is left there because they don't leave it. Up here on the hill, there's some men with a smoke fire with a beacon just to make sure that Shackleton had seen them. Have you given me a message? I'm going to press that. Yeah. 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 Instructions, right? Yeah, okay. So what I've done is a lot of research and managed to access some drone footage of the isthmus in Point Wild. And this is taken at about 50 metres. And this is a cliff, very steep cliff. This is the isthmus, and this is the area where the boats were. The Shackleton went back to Elephant Island in 1922 on what was called the Quest Expedition, and he wanted to see what the island looked like and what was left on the island from their encampment. You may recall that Shackleton on that expedition had a heart attack and died and was buried in South Georgia. But the men went back, and when they looked at the island and where they were camped, there was not a thing there, nothing there. And my theory is that what most likely happened is that, and you can see there's rough water here. There's ice and rocks. Here is a lot smoother. That it's quite likely some of the waves from the glacier calving have just flowed across the spit and stripped anything here into the bay on this side. All those little black dots are penguins, and the big dots are seals. That shows you a bit closer. So these are all fur seals, and these are all chin-strapped penguins. And that, trying to explain to the Antarctic Authority as to how or why we're allowed to go in there without disturbing these penguins is a big problem. And the answer is that we really can't go there in midsummer because the penguins are breeding, but there's a small window in March before it gets too cold again and the ice water freezes over. And I think that is really the only time we can go and safely manage. You can just run over here with a metal detector and do a search in the bay over here with magnetometers and other equipment. And that's really what I'm hoping to do with the group. We've got some funding. We've got some sponsors. We need more. We're planning to do it hopefully in March next year. And that's where it's up to. I think that's all I'm going to tell you. I think it's probably enough. I think more than enough. I'm glad you're sitting down because here's the rub, you see. I'm hoping that somewhere in the room there's people with a spare 50,000. And I'm hoping you'll just come and see me later. It'll be all right. And might be able to name something after you. If you haven't got 50,000, I do have some copies of my book there, and I'd be delighted if you buy them. Normally about $39, but tonight $30. A copy of Endurance. And I think that's all for me. I think I've probably gone way too long. But there you are. Yeah, I am happy to take
questions.
If there are questions. Yeah, that's probably. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. 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 Well, they did get some protein. I mean, they had seals. So they're eating meat. So that's pretty boring diet, and yeah. So no one died from scurvy on this trip because they really had access to meat. I think was probably the main thing. But yeah, it was dreadful. They would have had some tinned provisions. They would have kept a lot of the provisions they were intending to take on the sledding journey across Antarctica. So they brought with those, and they would have had some of those on Elephant Island. And they would still, I think, either be there or in the water alongside the spit, those supplies. But you're right, the diet would have been dreadful, and the men were very sick. A couple of them had heart attacks when they landed. You know, when they came ashore on Elephant Island, it was just very grim. They were freezing. One of the men, Lieutenant Hudson, the first thing he did, he had a knife. He just went up to the first seal, clubbed it to death, slit open its belly and shoved his hands inside to warm up his hands. So it was desperate times. Yeah.
One question down here. Yep. Is this back on, Graham?
I can talk badly, but thanks. I'll ask a question, I think. Thank you. Great talk, thank you. I think there was such a major story. There's a lot to it, I think, that you don't have time to touch on. I think I actually wanted to ask if that town of Rico, where they were eventually rescued, that mountain that you showed in the background, was that actually the one where they had to climb up over and almost fall down into the encampment of the Norwegians?
Correct. Yeah, no, I don't have an image of that, but that's right. So that's probably the biggest story of the lot, which I haven't relayed tonight, and that is that they did reach South Georgia by a feat of incredible navigation and using a sextant. open boat that's just rolling and rocking like this, and you're trying to take a reading and in cloudy sky. And they managed to get sufficient reading to make South Georgia, but when they got there, they landed on the wrong side. But the boat was, by this stage, stuffed, so there's no way they're going to try and sail around the other side. So, and the men were very sick as well on board, so they had to go ashore. And then three of them knew they had to climb up over the peaks because there was no one on that side at all. They had to get over to the whale station on the other side. They didn't have any equipment. They didn't have any mountaineering equipment. They didn't have any proper supplies. They didn't have proper clothing. They knew the only way to do it would probably normally be like a 3-day trip. They knew they had to do it without stop. So they just had to do it. They couldn't stop. If they tried to stop and stay still or fall asleep, they'd die for sure. So they just managed to do it all in one go. Took, over a day and a night, and they got eventually. It did slide down the other side and walked into this whaling station where they'd been, some years before, where everyone thought Shackleton was dead. And, he walked into the room and said, "I am Shackleton," and they couldn't believe it. Yeah, it's an incredible story.
Just a question, actually. So, how does one go about these days putting together an expedition? I presume there's some connection with the company that you've been with.
Yeah, they've offered sponsorship.
Buy a ship or anything?
No, you have to charter a boat. You've got to charter the right sort of boat. There's very few boats that are the right boat to go in those waters, and very few skippers I'd be comfortable going with who know those waters very well. And then it's fundraising and looking for philanthropists and people who have an interest and putting together the right scientists. So there's a bunch of marine archaeologists from Flinders University in South Australia and from Cambridge in UK who and also I should also mention the National Maritime Museum has taken an interest but not yet committed to undertake the expedition. And obviously there's a lot of science involved, which is a key part of it. And I feel like I'm a bit of a rank amateur amongst all that. But what I'm told when I talk to these experts, they say, no, we need someone to drive it. We need someone who's got that motivation just to push it and make it happen. And that's the role I've been trying to take on.
Is this Silent World Foundation that they run?
Yeah, so at the moment, the main funder is the Silent World Foundation, which is a private foundation with strong interest in marine archaeology. They've done a lot of work already in that area. They led the expedition that found the AE2, the Australian submarine that sank off Gallipoli, and I think they found the Australian submarine in the First World War that sank up in Asian waters. And they also found the Japanese vessel that had it was Australia's biggest maritime disaster. It was the Australian vessel that had all these. Sorry, it was a Japanese vessel that had a whole lot of Australian prisoners of war on, and was sunk by American. I'm going to get the name. Yeah. So they've done a lot of work in that area, and I'm hoping they'll be the main funder on this expedition as well. Yeah, so that's a very interesting thing. Shackleton these days, of course, is a hero. In that sense, he made it. But at the time, he was really unpopular. He probably should have joined the war effort. Winston Churchill said, no, just keep going. Go where you keep going to the Antarctica. I think he was a person with a big personality. I think he was a Knight of the Realm by this stage. He'd been knighted for his achievements getting near the South Pole some years earlier. But he was a very, he was very popular. He had popularity, and but that didn't mean he was in with the all important people in British life, and so he was regarded as a bit of a maverick, and of course the expedition didn't make money. It lost a lot of money, And the story, which again I haven't told tonight, is when we talk about the Shackleton expedition, we're only talking about the point where they set out to start the Trans-Antarctic crossing. There was another boat and another crew which landed in East Antarctica, which was meant to receive Shackleton and his crew and rescue them from the other side of Antarctica. They went to the other side of Antarctica and waited and waited and waited. A number of the men died on that expedition. And none of it was paid for. It turned out that Shackleton hadn't paid in advance for that. His expedition didn't have the money for it. So the Australian and New Zealand government had to chip in. Otherwise, there was this terrible risk that Shackleton would cross the continent, get there, and there'd be no one there to meet him. So Australia and New Zealand came to the party and funded a boat. They brought Mawson's old boat, the Discovery, and they took that round, and it landed a crew there who were to meet with Shackleton, and in addition, they were to take a series of supplies and establish various bases along the way to the South Pole, so that Shackleton, as he came across the South Pole, would be able to go and find each of these caches of food and supplies to make his way back. They did that. They laid all the caches, never knowing that, in fact, Shackleton didn't even set foot on Antarctica. And 3 of them died. And none of that was paid for. And similarly, the rescue of that whole party, Shackleton said, I'll captain that, I'll lead that rescue. The Australian government would have none of it. They wouldn't let him do it, and they were paying for it, and they did it themselves. Shackleton was allowed on board, but he was not in command.
And
So
from South Georgia, he went to Aurora. That's right.
Yes.
And he did really well.
Yes.
He went to the gentleman's club every evening.
Yep.
And he was there for months.
He was there for months.
While all the other fellas are starving to death.
Yeah. Yeah. True. Yeah. Yeah. He sort of saw himself as a sort of special envoy because the war was on. Argentina, Chile. What side were they going to come in on the war? There's like the society. There were a lot of Germans and British there, and so he saw himself as a special envoy to try and influence those countries to back Britain. And he was the toast of the town. They were famous. They were heroes. But then, Hurley was sent off back to London with the films to get the films made. Most of the crew went back to London straight away as soon as they got a chance to, and joined the war effort. And a lot of them were killed within the first year of the First World War, 1917. So they'd somehow survived for a couple of years on the Antarctic, and then went back, joined the military, and were killed on the Western Front. So it is an incredible story.
Another one over there.
If you do have an expedition and get down and you find artifacts in the water, is it likely that the water preserved because of the cold? You know that?
Yeah, there's a lot of science about that, and I think that is a factor. If they've been frozen, that they may be quite well preserved. The worst, there's a few possibilities. One possibility is that when the water freezes there, and then it thaws, it could lift up those objects, drift out to sea for miles and miles and miles, and then drop. So there's all sorts of things that could happen. The other issue is about what you can do if you do find or see artifacts. So the Antarctic Treaty deals with that pretty thoroughly. And one of the reasons for doing it is to stop people poaching, because otherwise I think what's going to happen is so many private boats going there, someone's just going to go in and do their own privateering. The technology has improved these days.
So trees go down and use from tools or whatever.
Mm.
Do they have to remain in situ?
Yeah, so the rules pretty much are there's a presumption things should remain in situ unless there's a reason for removing them, such as that they're going to be lost forever, or that they might serve a better purpose if they were in a museum somewhere, people could see them. But if we found a whole boat there, I think there'd be a strong argument it should stay there. That'd probably be the strongest argument. But smaller items, I think there'd be an argument they should be uplifted. And if they do get uplifted, then you have to have a curator on board straight away to preserve them if you're going to remove them from the water. And then where are they going to go? Well, they cost money to preserve all these things. And so some museums would run a mile because they think, well, we don't have the money or the staff to look after them. Others will take them on. And so the most likely place, I mean, I would love to think some could be in Australia, in an Australian museum, but I think the British museums are probably would be strong contenders for where they items might end up. But in any event, I think a proper survey needs to be done because there's a lot of people visiting that area right now. People love to go to Point Wild, and people don't know what they're walking on. They don't know, what is underground where they are. And I think a proper survey needs to be done so we can work out, where did they slaughter their animals? Are there bones there? What's underneath where the actual huts were? What happened to those stone walls? They built these solid stone walls. On the pictures, they seem to have disappeared, but I'm sure they maybe moved into the ocean or somewhere. So there's a lot of questions need to be answered, and that needs to happen before other people are sort of tramping all over it.
Okay, well, looks like we've exhausted it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Just hold on, I'd like to throw on Gary Sher to give a vote of thanks to you, Tim.
Thanks a lot.
Oops.
And another bit there.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much. Well, Tim and Jenny, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. If you're looking for $50,000 from me, I'm sorry, you missed out. I had to pay for 4 trips to Antarctica, unlike the charity that was shown to you. I met on one of the trips a guy who was a guide. He was one of the first people to study. He was from New Zealand. And it was he was talking on the dry valleys coming off the Ross Sea, where we helicoptered to on one of our trips. And we were just standing there looking at the ice as the boat is cutting through it. And he says, "You know what, Gary?" He said, "They paid me for this." He said, "I would have come for nothing." And it's absolutely true, because everybody who goes to Antarctica, and I'm sure you're in that category, has something happen to them that changes their lives, right? You had the heroes of Antarctica, like Frank Wild, who was put in charge of the Elephant Island group, and every day to keep spirits up in that wild place, Frank Wild would say to his men, "Come on, man, get up. The boss might be here today." That was Shackleton. And sure enough, one day he said it, and the boss was actually there. So that was great. Long-lasting memory I've got is the first trip to the Antarctic Peninsula in a zodiac, next to an iceberg at least as big as these buildings here. There was a little cave going into a dark blue sort of spot with stalactites and water dripping down. And I said to the zodiac person, "Could you just turn the engine off for a while so we can just be here in the moment?" And after about 5 minutes of hearing this drip, 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 and those deep blues in amongst the white and light blue iceberg, there was not a dry eye in the house. So that's the way it affected me on my first trip. Over 30 years, I've collected about 150 Antarctic books, which give me eternal pleasure. So I know that your special pleasure and your special gift to the whole Antarctic thing will be if you can finally nail the answers to those questions about just what is left behind on Elephant Island. It was too rough when we went past it. We just saw the statue from a distance, but that was about it. So I wish you better luck than we had. But look, I think we've all had it's great to just see the detail that you can go into on just one journey, your reflective journeys, and the previous ones that have happened. So yeah, I think if we all join our hands together to really show the appreciation for opening our eyes up to what is a wealth of experiences, if any of you are lucky enough to go here. Thank you.
Thanks again for that, for the presentation, and Jenny throwing in reminders, bits and pieces here and there. It's wonderful to have you. Thanks for travelling all this way to talk to us tonight.